Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Monday, February 19th, Indiana, over the weekend after a week-long break, falls by 4 at home to Northwestern in a game that actually wasn't as close as the final score indicated. Northwestern controlled the game for a good part of the second half before Indiana made a little bit of a late charge and fouled Northwestern, sent them to the line repeatedly, got it to what looks like a respectable 4-point loss. But as I said, Northwestern dominated the game for most of the second half. And rather than dive in specifically too much into that game or any of the previous games this season, I opened up the mailbag at our Inside the Hall basketball community at members.insidethehall.com last week to get some questions just to see where the fan base is at this point, and wanted to just take this week's podcast to answer these questions, and brought along a special guest to help me with some of these questions. Justin Albers, who was one of the first students that we ever had write for Inside the Hall, was on the IU beat for quite a long time and was a fill-in last season on Inside the Hall when Ryan Carrazza was out. He wrote the minute after, I think, for the last 10 games of the season, which was a much better season, obviously, than this one. Justin, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. I know we text after games routinely during games, and you've obviously got a pretty good perspective on IU for covering the program so long. So happy to have you on this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink to help me with some of these mailbag questions.
Yeah, Alex, thanks for having me back. It's ironic. It feels like every time that we start talking, where I start working with Inside the Hall again, Boo Buoy and Northwestern are somehow the topic of conversation. I feel like that was the first game when I returned last year, and he had the buzzer beater to beat IU in Evanston. So, and here we go again.
Yep, it was. It wasn't Boo Buoy though that got it done yesterday against Indiana. It was three guys, Martinelli, Nicholson, and Ryan Langborg, who weren't on any of those national recruiting rankings, under the radar guys, but Chris Collins has done a really good job. I feel like in recent seasons of being able to mold a team together. Brooks Barnheiser is another guy that he's really made into a good player. So Northwestern looking like a probable NCAA tournament team at this point. Indiana, on the other hand, not looking like much of a postseason team at this point, barring a miracle run through the Big Ten tournament next month in Minneapolis. So I've got these questions compiled, and they're kind of all over the place, but rather than try to group them into themes or anything, I'm just going to go through these as best we can. Might not hit all of them, but Justin's going to help me answer some of these. I'm going to obviously give my take on them, and we'll just kind of bounce through these and see where it takes us. It's always fun to have a mailbag episode of Podcast on the Brink. So we're going to start at the top with the Eastwood, who's a longtime member of the Inside the Hall community, going back to the days when it was the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. He's been a long-standing member. He asks, is Mike Woodson's age and lack of college basketball experience affecting his recruiting? I'll go ahead and kind of give my quick answer on this one. Justin, you can chime in after. I would say for the most part, I don't see his age being really a factor at all in terms of his recruiting. Overall, I mean, I look at what Woodson's been able to do in terms of acquiring talent. He's done a really good job, I think, for the most part. Now, has it always been the best collection of talent, or is there a lack of role players or guys to fill specific spots that he's missed on? Absolutely. But if you're just looking at this from a pure talent perspective, I mean, he's brought in obviously a one and done point guard in Jalen Hood-Schifino, brought in Malik Renew, brought in Tamar Bates, who obviously didn't pan out. Mackenzie Mbako is another guy who was signed with Duke. So from a talent perspective was right up there with the best of the best in the country. Khalil Ware's another guy he was able to bring in. Got Xavier Johnson from the transfer portal, Miller Kopp from the transfer portal. So he's brought in some good players. Recruiting to me has actually been a thing for the most part, that's been a strength for Woodson. So I don't really see it as a thing where his age or lack of college basketball experience affecting his recruiting. If anything, for the most part, I think in terms of just getting players, Woodson's done a pretty good job. Now, I caveat that with kind of what I said earlier. I do think there's been some misses just in terms of the type of player that he's targeting and getting guys to fill specific roles. But overall, I don't really see his age impacting at all, or his lack of college basketball experience. To me, he's done a pretty good job of getting players. Justin, your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I would agree with you, Alex. I don't see his age being the real problem here, or the problem in terms of recruiting. To the points you made, he can always hire a staff, and that's what his staff is there for. Not only at Indiana, but every university to help a coach with recruiting. And like you said, he's done a good job. He can, in addition to the things you mentioned, convinced Trace Jackson Davis to come back for another year. So I think he's done a pretty good job in that area. I will say, I think more and more the college game, the way that it's headed with NIL and all of the, new variables, uncontrollable variables, it does feel like it's more and more a young man's game. I think Nick Saban from the football side made a comment a month or two ago before he retired that there wasn't a doubt in the coaching circles the easier job is now in the pros. And, you've seen that on the football side with a lot of guys entertaining that or taking coordinator jobs in an NFL setting versus taking a head coaching job in college and everything that comes with it. I think a good piece of that holds true in the basketball side too. There's just less margin for error. You see guys like Chris Holtman who were, on everybody's probably top 25 coaches in America board preseason, done a pretty good job at Ohio State. The margin is just so thin that you have one down year. You let some games go. You don't bring the players in. You lose some of those close games. Suddenly he's out. So there's just a very small margin for error. I would say if there's one thing that Woodson's age, and really not so much his age, but his basketball life and experience, that I think hinders him at Indiana is just, the way he sees basketball. And, in my opinion, sometimes his unwillingness to deviate from the way that he sees basketball, almost playing at times an NBA style with guys just not capable of playing in that style. So, in college, I think more so than any other level, you have to coach to your roster and your players and be able to adapt to the different teams that you have. It feels at times like he's a one style guy who's slow to change that, but the players also have to execute as well.
Up next on the mailbag, Jaron Harris. I hope I said his first name right. He asks, is having one incoming freshman and filling the remaining scholarships with transfers a sustainable method of building a roster? Justin, I'll let you take a crack at that first. I've got some thoughts, but interested to kind of hear what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I would say no. I don't think anytime you're having large roster overturns every season, it's probably not sustainable unless you're, maybe a Kentucky of the world, but even they have had some down years with all of the roster turnover that they. So I think it, whether it's one and dones coming in and then leaving, or bringing in one scholarship player and everybody else has 1 year left from the transfer portal, it doesn't feel sustainable. But at this point in time, it's hard to really know what does feel sustainable in college basketball, because even the programs that have built traditionally still lose guys to the transfer portal, that guys that they would love to keep, or, the guy takes off a year early and now he's eligible for the NBA draft and he's gone. The NIL money, luring kids away from smaller schools into bigger programs so that they can get paid earlier. There's so many more factors now that it's so hard to be sustainable with almost any model in college basketball outside of just a solid coaching structure and infrastructure around. So I guess my short answer would be no. The long answer is, in this current state of college basketball, what method is sustainable, Alex?
Yeah, I think you make a great point because it's still up for interpretation given where we are with the changing landscape in college basketball. It's only been a couple of years now where we've kind of have this. I kind of refer to it as free agency, the free agency period in the NBA, where you have the portal open and guys are moving all around. It's similar, and it's a much bigger scale because there's a lot more teams and a lot more players. Now, I think it can happen. You can do that like every couple of years. I don't think necessarily it's something you want to do continuously for this specific situation with Indiana going into this offseason. Obviously, there's a lot of variables to kind of to consider, but it's not necessarily a bad thing the spot Indiana's in right now in terms of just having one incoming freshman, because for them, in order for them to kind of get back to being a tournament team next year, they're going to need to bring in a lot of guys who are older players who are capable of filling, major minutes next season. I don't necessarily think you want to have, going into a season like next year, a ton of young guys trying to develop. So for this particular scenario with Indiana, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. But the one thing I'll say kind of long term with recruiting, and this goes for any program that's consistently kind of diving in the same waters in terms of the ranking of prospects that Indiana is going after. One thing I would have liked to seen a little bit more of kind of the last couple of recruiting cycles is Indiana targeting players that are maybe, in that 50 to 60 to 120 ranking in the rank, in the national rankings, rather than going for the cream of the crop, because you do have to have some guys that are going to stick around for multiple years and develop. And the biggest problem, I think, not the biggest problem with this roster, but one glaring issue with this problem, or with this roster in particular at Indiana, there's not a lot of younger players that you can point to who have been backups or guys that have developed, that you look to and say, this guy's going to be a starter next year or in the future. I mean, Gabe Cupps is obviously a guy that's kind of been given a bigger role than anticipated earlier in his career, but Caleb Banks is not really playing at all anymore as a sophomore. CJ Gunn's been really up and down. So I think Indiana moving forward really needs to kind of identify some of these guys who are maybe ranked a little bit lower in the rankings, not, a surefire one and done or even a 2-year player, get them in the program, have them kind of build up their role incrementally. And then by the time that they're a junior or a senior, kind of like a Trey Galloway, they're a productive player. So that would be my answer. I agree with Justin. It's not a sustainable method long term, but for one season, I think it can work.
Yeah, I think 100%, Alex. And I would just say it's almost like the Kansas model, right? Like ideally, you would have guys like DeJuan Harris, McCullough, guys that were, played some smaller role on your teams the past couple of years, but were there to develop while you had stars in those roles. And then by the time those guys leave, they're ready to become stars. You fill it around them with the transfer in Dickinson. You add a young freshman in Adams, and now you've got a team that's really good. That but it all really stems from getting those guys to stay in school. And to your point about getting guys outside the top 50, sometimes that's where you have to go to get guys that will be willing to commit to your and playing for your program for more than a year at a time. And that would be my last point on that. Just one more thing before we move to the next question. You mentioned the lack of young or even role players that come off the bench and help Indiana. That's one trend when you look back at the time that Woodson's been at Indiana, has been consistent of all of his teams. Last year, by the time we got to this point in the year, they were pretty much playing the same 5, maybe 6 guys all 40 minutes. And, looking at the minutes log from the Northwestern game, you're starting to see that same thing. He's starting to play Mbako, Renew to a lesser extent because of foul trouble, Ware, Galloway, Cupps, the guys that he decided he now relies on. He plays those guys 30 plus minutes, and the other guys are now not getting any minutes now. I guess we could debate, does that mean we just don't have a talent at Indiana? Or does that mean Woodson's not developing the talent to the point that they can play in February and March and help a team? It's probably some of both, but just something I've noticed all 3 years of Woodson's time at Indiana.
Good points there, Justin. Moving along to the next question, it's a loaded question from Cincy Hoosier, a little bit longer, but I feel like I'm going to read the whole thing here just to kind of get the full thing out. Couple of question marks, so it's a little bit longer. But he writes: "Is this one down bad rebuilding year that is salvageable by bringing in the right guys this spring?" And then he puts in parentheses, "and moving on from some potentially wrong guys." Or even with a bounce back year next year, is this still a shaky situation that does not project well in the long term? IU may never consistently compete for Final Fours or championships, but they should at least be in the NCAA tournament every year. Justin, you want to jump on that one? Obviously, that's a pretty loaded question, so I'm not sure if there's a clear-cut answer, but what's your thought there?
I think that what sticks out immediately is I think that's the right expectation for Indiana fans to have is, I think you certainly know it, having been in the business all these years, but, you don't have to spend all that much time in IU basketball circles on social media to understand that a lot of fans' expectation is still a Final Four bust or, a Final Four every so often. I think, a realistic expectation at this point in time, Indiana is not a blue blood school. So, but they should be making the NCAA tournament every year. So that's kind of the first part that stuck out. In terms of whether or not it's a one bad year that's salvageable, I think anything's always salvageable, especially if, you were able to get some of these guys that have contributed to stay and then build on top of it. But I don't really necessarily see it that way. I don't know that Indiana in its current situation with its current staff, infrastructure, and, what we know today about who's on the roster and who is, projected to come to the roster, I don't see this getting fixed anytime within the next couple of years. So I don't see it as just one down, bad rebuilding year. And I don't even know, you mentioned that wrong was in parentheses on the question in terms of wrong guys. Indiana had wrong guys in the Tom Crean era at times, when Hunter Mosquera-Perea and that class came in and really just almost infected the program from the inside. I don't think you have any of that, like those kind of wrong guys on this program. You probably just have some guys that don't necessarily fit together or aren't being used correctly. Some guys are not even getting an opportunity, and I'd love your thoughts at some point on Caleb Banks, because I really, as a fan on the outside, expected that he would contribute in some way this year. But my, long way to get to a short answer, I don't see it as just one down year. I think it's salvageable long term, but honestly, I don't believe it's salvageable under this coaching staff.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to look at and forecast, because you don't really know what the roster is going to look like next season. And you're really, I'm under no impression that Indiana is going to change its coach for next season. I would be surprised if that were the case. But in terms of being able to forecast if it's going to be better next year, you really have to know who's coming and going. And as we sit here right now on February 19th, we don't have a clear answer on that. We'll start to get some answers about, a month from today when the transfer portal opens. And I've been operating under the assumption that Khalil Ware is going to be gone to the NBA because all of the draft boards have him as a first round pick. And I think if you're a first round pick, you go pro. But other than that, we don't have a clear understanding. And that's not just unique to Indiana. We don't know who's going to be on a lot of teams around the country. I think if the right moves are made in terms of roster construction and who's brought in, and the right players come back and you get some of these portal guys who I think are going to be available, I do think there's a chance they could be a better team next year, but a lot of things are going to have to go right. And so that's kind of where you run into a lot of programs are going to be in this situation where there's going to be pressure on coaches to be better next year. They're going to be coaching for their job. And that's kind of where the AD has to make an assessment of the program and say, with what I see here, do I think this is going to be better next year? And do we give it another year to see how it all shakes out? That's a really tough thing to decide when you don't have a clear picture of the roster, because what you don't want to happen is, you give a vote of support and you say, all right, Mike Woodson's coming back for another year, which I believe that's what most of us believe is going to happen going into next year. And then all of a sudden things go poorly in the portal, guys leave, and then it's an even worse situation for next year. That's just going to be a lot in terms of the athletic department to deal with the negativity and what it's going to look like in Assembly Hall, because it's already starting to get pretty toxic with some parts of the fan base being displeased, and that's perfectly within their right. I mean, people spend money to go to these games, they're donating money to NIL, and they expect better results. And I think it's, as you said, perfectly fair to expect Indiana to go to the tournament every year. I will say in Mike Woodson's defense, he did go to the tournament the last 2 seasons. And maybe this is a blip on the radar, and this is just a bad mix of players. But it's hard to really give that answer without knowing what the roster is going to look like. So, not to dodge the question, but that's kind of where I'm sitting from that perspective at this point in time.
But they do have to make that decision, right, Alex? And let recruits
I mean,
and potential recruits know that he is coming back or he isn't. You can't. I mean,
you've got to say something. I mean, maybe it's just assumed that he's coming back. I think that's kind of what everyone believes is going to happen. And I think with Indiana basketball, I mean, they gave Archie Miller 4 years. They gave Tom Crean a long. He obviously won 2 Big Ten titles, went to 3 Sweet 16s. He was there for 9 seasons. I just don't see Indiana as a program that is going to move on from a coach after they make the tournament, especially an alum who was, a really great player for the program and came back and brought him back to the tournament 2 straight years. I don't see them making a drastic move after the season. But yeah, I agree. I mean, you do have to come out and whichever direction you're going to go, you got to be decisive and confident in the move you're making, whether that's to back the coach and say, this is kind of the reasons why we felt this season wasn't up to standard and what is going to be done to fix it in the future. Because if you just act like it's business as usual and there's no, public response given, people are going to start to say, well, so this was just okay. This was just this is kind of the norm at Indiana. I don't think you ever want that to become the dialogue around the program. Otherwise, you're kind of setting yourself up to lower expectations over a long period of time. And the one thing, Indiana's not won big now for a long time, but I do feel like, at least from the fan base perspective, there is some accountability just in terms of what they expect. And I don't think it's unrealistic, as you said, to expect a tournament every year. So let's move on. Go ahead.
Just real quickly. I mean, selfishly, as an IU fan, I'd almost rather hear it from him. I'd rather hear him, feel empowered enough to say, hey, I'm not going anywhere, guys. And I'm, still committed to bringing Indiana back to, where I know it belongs and where I've seen it as a player in the past. That's one thing that I think has been lacking over, early on. Woodson was very good about, the way he spoke, and it was very clear that he had a hold over the program and a real pride that he wanted to get it back where it belonged. You haven't, he's almost been dodgy and borderline strange in some of his answers, and I would say over the last 4 or 5 weeks, which I can understand. It's not an easy job to be the head coach of a major program that has high expectations and you're not meeting them. But I think it would go a long way if rather than the program saying, yeah, he's definitely back, he, you know, whether it comes at the end of the season or whenever it comes, recommits that his goal at Indiana, because I think, anytime you made a really good point about the NIL and transfer portal. I guess really any school could be salvageable 1 year after the next because it is kind of like the NBA, but without a salary cap. So you could have 7 or 8 guys theoretically leaving a team and going somewhere else and bringing 7 or 8 new guys in. And what those guys are going to be looking for, number one, probably money in the same way NBA. And number two, can they win? And so if they see a coach saying, I'm going to be here and I'm going to take Indiana back to where it belongs, I just think it would mean a lot more coming from him than from the university. But either way, they can't play the middle.
Right. Dave Holdsworth has a question, and I think this was submitted before the Northwestern game, which Indiana lost. So I think it may change just a little bit in terms of what he was going to ask. But he asks if IU wins all of their remaining regular season games except at either Minnesota or Penn State, then loses in their first Big Ten tournament game, is that enough to get in the dance? He said, seems like it, yet they're digging out of a pretty big hole. It's tough to even entertain this question because Indiana's now lost 4 home games and they're not going to be favored they may be favored against Nebraska on Wednesday. If they are, it'll be as a slight favorite, but other than that, I don't see them being a favorite the rest of the season. So if they were able to win the rest of their regular season games, I guess there's a chance they would be able to get into the tournament at this point, but it's just so unrealistic that it's even hard to entertain the possibility just based on how this season has gone. I mean, so many things would have to go right. Indiana would have to play completely different than what we've seen in recent weeks for that to even happen. I think their best chance at this point to get into any type of postseason is to have some type of run in the Big Ten tournament to where they would be able to get enough wins to either get the automatic bid by either winning the thing, which Indiana fans don't need to be reminded of this. Indiana's never won the Big Ten tournament, or getting deep into that event and then having a chance to maybe get an NIT bid, because I don't even think that's a given at this point based on the overall record and where their computer numbers are. Justin, any thoughts on the tournament, or do you agree with me that it's just kind of too much, too crazy of a scenario to even picture Indiana kind of winning out the rest of the regular season or making a run in the Big Ten tournament at this point?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's hard enough for me to envision them playing a clean half of basketball, much less, a few solid weeks of basketball and beating, elite teams, especially away from home, what you'd have to do to have any chance. But if, I will say if there's any year, this is probably the year, right? Because the Big Ten, for the most part, has been wide open. Purdue's dominated the league, but outside of them, everybody's Wisconsin's on quite a slide now. Everybody's beatable. So the margin is slim. Indiana could have won a lot of these games, but just, the issues with the team, I just can't see, them building 2 wins together, much less, 5 or 6. You have to make free throws, can't turn over the ball, and you can't give up so many offensive rebounds. Just those 3 things alone, make them, unlikely to win, more than probably 2 at the most of their remaining regular season games, and that might be generous.
Yep. So the next question, Myrtle fan, he got straight to the point and even put my name in the question. So he definitely wants my opinion on this, but we're also going to get an opinion from Justin. But he writes, are you, Alex, on the side of replacing Woody as early as this offseason? I'll go first because the question is directed at me. I want to see how the rest of the regular season plays out. I want to see if, kind of where Indiana gets just in terms of the number of wins. If they lose out the regular season, they lose the first game of the Big Ten tournament, I don't know how you can feel great about what's to come for the program. The biggest part in this decision, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, but I just want to reiterate that if there even is a decision, which again, I'm operating under the assumption that Mike Woodson's going to be Indiana's coach next season because that's, I mean, he, like I said, he made the tournament the first couple of years in Bloomington, and I think he's going to get a chance to figure it out and right the ship. But the biggest part in evaluating any program when you're looking at a down season and a path to getting better is can you see a scenario where things get demonstrably better next year? And I think if the answer to that question is no, then you have to really take a much closer look at doing something, because it's you're setting you're going to set yourself up for failure as not just the program and the players in the program, but also as an athletic department and somebody who has to host whatever 2021 regular season home games next season. If you're going to put a product on the court that's not any better next year, I don't see how that's a win for anybody. So I think that's where you have to really take a deep analysis of what is going to happen in terms of the roster in the offseason. I think probably inside the doors of Cook Hall and Assembly Hall, the coaches have to have a pretty decent idea if there's certain guys who are going to be, looking to enter the transfer portal, or what they're going to, you have to, that stuff's already happening behind the scenes. I mean, if you're on Trilly Donovan's Discord, he's already got like a running list of guys he's expecting to enter the portal. These conversations are already happening behind the scenes. So I think you have to really take a deep dive and analysis of what you're going to have in terms of a team next year. And if it's going to be this level of a team again or worse, then I do think you have to look at it, because I don't think anyone wants to go through a situation next season where every single game is an indictment on the coach. I mean, that's kind of what happened at the end of the Tom Crean era. Justin, you remember, you were on the beat at this time, but once Crean lost it was that Syracuse game, I think it was in year 5, it felt like outside of the one season where they won the Big Ten outright, 2015, 2016, and even that season started off shaky, the fan base was already convinced that he wasn't the coach. And it's not that they didn't root for the team or they didn't want the team to do well, but every time something negative happened or a loss happened, it was people calling for his job. And that's just not a healthy way for a program and a fan base to coexist. And so that's why I think and it's tough. I mean, it would be a lot easier, I think, in the non-portal era to have a grasp on this, because you would just look at what's coming in next season and you have one recruit, and realistically you couldn't get guys immediately eligible in the past with the old rules unless they were a grad transfer. So you'd be looking at this like much differently than you are now with the portal and all the resources available. So that's kind of where I'm at on it. I want to see what happens the rest of the way. I want to see how Indiana plays the rest of the season. I was very discouraged. It was very discouraging to see how they played yesterday with a full week to prepare, and that's how you come out and play offense in the first half and just really beat by a undermanned Northwestern team that didn't have its A game. Boo Buie wasn't his normal self in that game at all, and Indiana still was beaten pretty soundly. I know it was a 4-point game, but by Northwestern. So long story short, I kind of want to see what happens the rest of the way, but I do think any AD has to be looking at all the scenarios in their head right now and figuring out what's best for the long-term future of any, not just Indiana basketball, but any program, any school. That's the mentality I think you have to have when you look at these situations.
Yeah, I'm not in favor of replacing a coach for the sake of replacing a coach, and that's it. I think some people, make those statements, but there's no real clear answer. Where are you going? What's the primary reasoning? If I was the administration, I'd want to know, how committed is he still to doing this? Because he's, like we talked about at the top with the first question, he's not a young guy. College basketball is not, where he made his name in terms of coaching. Does he still, feel like after 3 years, given what he knows about what the off seasons are like and going through the portal and what the workload looks like, is he Does he still want to do it? And so I'd be having those conversations behind closed doors and, asking him some of the hard questions, like player development. What you could argue that, maybe only one or two players have really truly developed because of Woodson's style. Obviously Renew's gotten better, Jackson Davis got better, but I would attribute a lot of Renew's improvement to Jackson Davis and being able to be around him. So outside of that, not a ton of guys got better. Now, obviously, Khalil Ware coming in from Oregon is leaps and bounds, I think, above where any of us thought he would be from the very beginning of the season. How much does that have to do with Woodson? Hard to say, but probably not a ton, since it wasn't, almost an immediate impact from him. So I'd want to know, what you plan to do in terms of player development, and then I'd make it known as an administration, hey, we'd like to get back to the fundamentals and back to who Indiana is. We'd like to recruit some of those kids like a Langborg type from Northwestern coming in from Princeton, guys that are just pure shooters. And, just watching that game yesterday, the way that having a guy like that can change the entire game, because you have to, basically use two guys to show off the screen and contest him at all times. Indiana hasn't had anybody like that in a long time. I guess probably Zeisloff would be the closest one in recent memory. But, you used to always see a Matt Roth or a Jordan Hulse type on an Indiana team. I'd make it clear as an administration to Woodson, let's add pieces like that back and not keep making the same mistakes year after year, where personnel wise, we have no shooting. We try, we have no real identity, because when push comes to shove, we're going to throw it inside. 4 or 5 people will converge, and then nobody on the perimeter is capable of making a wide open shot. So how about we stop repeating the same thing we've seen for years? And if he's receptive to that, if he, he seems, at least in how he talks to the media, to be a fairly stubborn guy. And I understand why that would be after his, long career in basketball and coaching. But if he's willing to, make a couple changes and his heart is still 100% in it, I'm not in favor as an Indiana grad of just turning over coaches year after year and, going to the next guy, unless you have a real, guy that can fix the program in mind. I don't make that move after 3 years. That's just me. But again, I would like to, if Woodson's heart isn't fully in it, he feels like, hey, man, this is way harder than I thought it would be. It's time to say goodbye. Then, yeah, you had the conversation. But unless that happens, I would be in favor of letting him have a 4th year.
IUB Ball 81 up next on this mailbag edition of Podcast on the Brink. Do the new portal rules with NIL allow the rich to get richer, or is it adding parity? Justin, any thoughts on the portal and NIL in terms of parity in college basketball?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I really do think it is adding parity. I know why the thought of the rich getting richer would come in, but the fact of the matter is, in the same way that maybe a Kentucky used to bring in 4 or 5 stars a year, 1, maybe 1.5, 2 of those 5 stars are not going to, hit like 5 stars. The same holds true for the guys you're giving NIL money to. You're going to have the same miss rate. I think what it's doing is giving, schools that wouldn't traditionally have a chance at a 5-star at all an opportunity to get one. Each school almost has the opportunity to have at least one of those guys. And so you're seeing non-traditional schools building teams in, fairly non-traditional ways and having success doing it. So, just looking at, if you just turn on a college basketball game from any conference on any given night, you might see anybody get upset. So I think it's actually adding a lot of parity. And just looking in the Big Ten Conference, you look at the schools near the top that have been competing this year. It's not, outside of Purdue, to some extent Illinois, it's not really your normal powers. I know Michigan State's coming on, but the league is pretty much wide open. And I would argue that the college basketball as a whole is pretty wide open again this year. So, I don't have any tangible evidence behind it, but just, anecdotally, it appears to me that it's actually adding parity.
Yeah, I think a lot of people thought that with the portal that there would be programs that just buy a completely new team and buy all the best players every year. But there's still, at some point, there has to be an ROI for NIL long term. And I think the market is still kind of settling and setting itself. But I do think, when this particular Indiana team is an example, I mean, there's I'm sure several players on this roster that are making a lot of NIL money, and when you see it not working out, then the people who are contributing to the NIL are going to say, do we want to continue to give this amount of money, or do we want to, or do we want some type of change in approach in terms of how the NIL money is being spent? Because that is a thing that is going to become under more scrutiny as the years go along. I mean, it would be all great if, you could buy 4 or 5 players every year and spend your money and get a team that was competitive, but it doesn't work that way because you have to mold the pieces together and make them fit together. And the best coaches are doing a combination of bringing in good freshmen, talented freshmen that can help them win, taking their players from within the system, developing them, keeping them around for multiple years, and then going out in the portal and adding a couple pieces that can put the team over the top. That's how you build a roster in modern college basketball. Indiana's not hitting on all of those points, and so that's why you see the inconsistencies. But as it pertains to the game at large, I don't think we know for sure what the long-term impact of the transfer portal is, but there's a lot of good players that have come into the Big Ten this year that have been from like the Missouri Valley Conference. And we're seeing now, I think in general, that overall there's a lot of guys around the country that are just good players. And when given an opportunity to play in a bigger stage, they're going to be able to perform. There's not a huge gap with a lot of these teams between, guys who are playing in the Big Ten or guys who are playing in the Missouri Valley. So it's about finding the right guys for your system and getting them to work within that system. So I don't think it's too hard. I think it's too early to draw any definitive conclusions, but I do think the assumption that certain teams are just going to be able to buy a roster and be good year in and year out, I don't think that works because that there's too many intangibles that you don't consider under that scenario, like how a coach is going to mix the pieces together, how the players are going to fit together. And you also have the injury standpoint of all of it that kind of just makes it too hard to make a broad judgment this early, I think, in the NIL era.
Yeah, I think your point is probably the right one there, Alex, over mine, in that, you can see it in the NBA, but certainly throughout basketball at any level, there's just more talent now. There's just more good players. You look at a team like Indiana State, who I think is, probably top 40 KenPom right now, 22-5, a smaller school, but they have, played and beaten legitimate teams. And there's a lot of other examples like that one where, it's not even that they're getting 5-star recruits because of NIL. It's just that the quality of player is so much better, it seems like now, which almost makes it more frustrating as from an Indiana basketball standpoint that, you watch some of these schools and they can go, 7, 8 deep off their bench with guys that have, very specialized skills. And Indiana is rolling with, for the most part, the same 5 guys, and the 3 guys they bring in off the bench, most of them can really only do one thing. They don't have really any distinguishable skill, in my opinion. And often, do something silly that puts them right back on the bench, like, Walker immediately shooting a 3 upon entering the game when that is not at all his role on the team. So I think that was a good point. Basketball, I think, just as a whole, there's better talent at every level of college basketball right now, and that's probably impacting parity just as much as the NIL.
I'm going to hit a couple of these questions quickly, and then we'll get to a couple others to kind of close this out. Mark Kopic asks, does IU still have any path to the NCAA tournament? And if so, what does that look like? We kind of went over that earlier. To me, the path is win the Big Ten tournament. So not going to say much more than that. I think we covered it earlier. But Mark is one of the more valuable members of our community over at members.insidethehall.com. So wanted to definitely acknowledge his question. Thank you for the question. Frails asks, do you think Ja'Kai Newton can help us next season with all the time he's missed? Hard to really project what to expect out of Ja'Kai Newton. I do remember watching film of him from his high school days before he had injuries and thinking, man, this is the kind of athletic, strong guard that Indiana needs and Indiana lacks. But he's been through a ton with the injuries, has sat out all this season. You just hope that for his sake, he's able to get back and make a positive contribution next season on the court. I think he's kind of a forgotten player at this point, but if he is 100% healthy, I definitely think he's a player that can help, assuming he's able to get back to his pre-injury levels of athleticism. Next on the list for the questions, Hoosier Jake asks, what parts of the job does Mike Woodson do well? What parts of the job need improvement? We've talked a little bit about some of these things. I can just kind of go high level. I don't want to make this a full episode of breaking down Mike Woodson's job in terms of running Indiana basketball. As I said earlier in the show, I do think he deserves credit for making the tournament the last 2 seasons. This season's obviously gone very poorly, and it's his team, it's his roster, it's his program now, so he's the one that deserves the blame. I do think for the most part, from what I've seen, he's got a pretty good relationship and rapport with his players. I think he relates to players, and I think they respect him because of everything that he's done in the game of basketball. Obviously, there's been some hits and misses in terms of recruiting and player development, but there are some examples like Trace Jackson Davis taking his game to another level. Was able to, bring in a guy like Jalen Hood-Schifino and help him go pro after 1 season. Hood-Schifino wasn't, a guy that most draft boards had as a first round pick entering his freshman season. So being able to showcase him and get him to the league after 1 year, early in his tenure, I would have said Mike Woodson did a pretty good job coaching defense. Indiana did have the best defense in the Big Ten his first year, but that's really regressed now the last couple of seasons. So I think that would put that under more of an improvement moving forward. To kind of address your question in terms of the improvement, the biggest thing I think needs to change is just piecing together a roster of guys that make sense together and not just trying to collect talent and hoping it fits. You have to look at what's missing from this team. And right now it's a lot of fundamental things like guys who can properly box out and rebound, guys who can make free throws, guys that can make a 3-point shot, guys who can take care of the ball and not turn it over. You can't just take all this talent together and think that it's going to work. Indiana, in terms of recruiting rankings, is more talented than most of the teams it plays, but unfortunately, that's not how it works. It's not a video game where you just kind of simulate to the end of the season and the team with the most talent wins the most games. It's about putting your players in the best position to win and, collecting the most collecting talent together that fits together well. You don't need a 5-star or a 4-star at every position. You need guys that know their role and can fill it. And I think that's been the biggest disappointment for me, particularly when it comes to the transfer portal. You look at this past offseason. Okay, he got Khalil Ware, who was a great ad. Nobody's going to turn down Khalil Ware. He was considered a top 5 ad from the transfer portal. But then you look, Anthony Walker, he's done some good things this season, but was he really what Indiana needed? Peyton Sparks, was he what Indiana needed when they have, I know he committed before Khalil Ware, but was he really the type of player you needed? To me, you needed more guys on the wing that could shoot, create, play make for other players, and they didn't do that. So that to me is the biggest criticism that I can give Mike Woodson is just the way that the roster fits together. This particular season has not been good, and I think it's something that needs to change in the future. Justin, any thoughts on Woodson and as a whole in terms of what he does well and maybe areas for improvement? Obviously, don't want to go too long on this, but I wanted to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I have a couple quick points, but just a real quick question for you on it first. Why did that empty scholarship stay empty? I mean, is that
it's
very
a good
unusual?
question.
I mean, it feels to me when the glaring needs that you mentioned right off the top of that answer, and you have an open scholarship, you know, it doesn't have to be a 4-year scholarship. You could give it to a guy that can come in for 1 year. Maybe he's a shooter. Maybe he doesn't play a ton, but why not use it? And I don't feel
Yeah,
like I've heard a great answer to that question.
I don't have a great answer because I don't think it's ever been explained, and at this point, I don't know that anybody's going to ask it because it's in the past and you can't really go back and change it. But I've always kind of said, Indiana had an idea last spring that Newton was hurt and they didn't know what his status was going to be. You knew Xavier Johnson was coming off of an injury, and you also knew that Anthony Leal wasn't a guy that in the past couple of years you trusted to play at all. So really, you were going into a season with Johnson coming off of an injury, Newton coming off of an injury, and Leal is a guy who you weren't sure you really wanted to play. And plus, you leave an open scholarship. You're not leaving yourself much room for error. So to me, that was one of the more puzzling decisions because how much different does this season look perhaps if you had a guy that was a 2 or a 3 that could knock down a 3-point shot reliably at a decent volume? I think Indiana would be a much different team. So I don't think that in hindsight was a great move.
Yeah. Just 2 quick points because we don't want to harp on this, but one's more related to Woodson, one's just a team. I would think one of the weaknesses I'd like to see corrected is just how they initiate offense. I think, and I don't have the specific numbers on this, but I wish I did. When they start their offense with a high ball screen, with either Cups, but more specifically Galloway handling the ball, usually Ware setting the screen, their success rate has to be 4 or 5x what it is when they run their normal offense, which seems to be, like I mentioned earlier, an NBA style where the ball handler dribbles up top by himself and all of the screening action is being run off ball and guys are getting held up off screens. And, so many turnovers have happened because they're very, very sloppy in that set. But for whatever reason, when they get down 14, 16 points and their backs are against the wall, they suddenly start playing the way that you wish they would always play. They give the ball to Galloway. They run pick and roll to initiate offense almost entirely, very similar to how Purdue plays with Edey up top. But starting the offense that way almost always creates a lane for Galloway for a floater, which he's great at, mid-range for Cups if he's the ball handler. And if that's not open, Ware, as we've seen, is always wide open for the lob. And shooters are usually open in the corners off that. But for whatever reason, they probably only run out of that 1/4 of the time, I would have to guess, when they initiate offense. So I just don't understand why they don't, simplify the offense and run out of a simple high ball screen to get things going and play out of it. Just a pet peeve of mine all year. But, I think the other thing is really more about the players than it is about Woodson, because you mentioned their defense being really good in year 1 under Woodson. For long stretches, it can be good this year. I think they have, the personnel is not elite, but it's good enough to be a really solid Big Ten defense. And I think even using the Northwestern game as an example, there was at least 4 or 5 times where they played probably 45 seconds of incredible defense on a possession only to give up a basket because they gave up an offensive rebound after a 30-second, heave, and then Northwestern gets it, runs it back out, has 20, goes in and scores. So I really think that's killing their defense, just the offensive rebounds. And then, just from a morale standpoint, you defend that hard, play that hard, and then that's the result. That's really hurt them. But that's Woodson can play a role in that, but there's just a toughness missing to this team that you've seen on past teams, and a guy that's tough enough to get his teammates to elevate out of and play, at a tougher level, like we've seen from guys like Jackson Davis or Farrell or Thomas Bryant or Oladipo in the past. They don't really have that guy. I mean, Galloway always plays hard, but I wouldn't necessarily characterize him as a leader. He doesn't, he's not the raw guy that's bringing his teammates together on the floor and telling them where they need to be. So those are the things I think they're missing. To your point, though, player type. You just need, complementary players around some of the talent that you have, and they don't have it.
Yep. Last question of the mailbag here. There was another question that just to kind of about Woodson and what Indiana should do. I think we talked about that earlier in the show, so don't want to really kind of go over that again. But this one does kind of have somewhat to do with that question, but maybe asked in a little bit different way. Who's your fan 76? Will the timing of Holtman, he's talking Chris Holtman's exit at Ohio State, make any difference regarding the pressures IU will be facing to make a decision about Coach Woodson? Justin, any thoughts on that one?
It's an interesting question, but I don't think so. I know that, I probably got 20 texts from IU fans when that decision was made, basically saying the same thing, that, hey, IU can get Holtman on the cheap right now. So I know that there's a segment of IU fans that would like to see them move on from Woodson and bring Holtman in. But to our answers earlier, I'm not in favor of doing it unless you're 100% sure that, Woodson can't get this fixed and that it's, going to continue to drop and go in a bad direction and has no potential to improve. I'm not sure that I feel that. And, I guess that question could go two ways. Does it raise pressure because it's a premier program like Ohio State in conference making a move that IU fans think they should make? I don't think IU fans or IU as an administration will worry about the noise externally and making a decision on that. But it also, on the other side of the coin, is Holtman somebody that's coveted by the Indiana administration that they would want to go and get? And since he's available, they would consider making a move to do it. I don't see him at that level. He's not. There's probably 2 or 3 coaches where if you knew you could get him, you get rid of the guy you have and go after him. I don't see Holtman on that list, so I don't really see it impacting IU's decision at all. What do you think?
Yeah. I didn't read it as the question as Indiana going after Holtman. I read it more as, does the fact that Ohio State's open and it's an attractive job, does that put more pressure on Indiana if they're going to make a move to kind of let it be known that it could be open so that they can attract, a strong candidate to their job? Because they're also going to be competing in the hypothetical situation, if Indiana were to open, they're obviously going to be, at this point, they would be competing with Ohio State. There would be the opening that's probably going to be taking place at Louisville. So I think that may be kind of where the question was coming from. But I also want to point out that the situation with Holtman and Mike Woodson are completely different, in that Chris Holtman has had, he's been at Ohio State, or had been at Ohio State since 2017, obviously had some success in terms of making the NCAA tournament in, I believe, his first 5 seasons. Well, obviously the COVID season, he wasn't able, there wasn't a tournament, so you can't really count that against anybody that didn't make the tournament, but made the tournament all those years. The thing with Holtman was they had a bad year last year. He had to come back this year and make the tournament and prove that the program was headed in the wrong direction, or in the right direction again, and he wasn't able to do that. So Gene Smith makes the move. When he has clear evidence that this team's not going to the tournament, he went ahead and made the move. But I don't think it has anything to do with the IU situation. And obviously Holtman did get an opportunity to have a season where he was able to given a chance to show that he could right the ship. And I believe that's what we think is going to happen with Mike Woodson next year in Bloomington. So good question. But I think if it was, a situation where you had a coach that you knew for sure that you were going to be moving on, and another top program that might be fighting for similar candidates fired their coach, then you may be feeling a little pressure to kind of make sure the word's out there that, hey, we're going to be open too. We're going to be looking at swimming in the same pool. But I don't see that as an apples to apples situation here with Indiana and Ohio State.
Yeah, that's a good read by you. probably read it in a different way. But building off of that point, I think you also have to be careful with, okay, we're swimming in the same pool, but how you handle the Woodson situation is also really important because of who he is to the program. You can't unceremoniously, just separate from him where you leave bad blood on both sides. And because Woodson, obviously, there's a huge portion of the IU fan base that will ride with the Woodson Knight, in the same way that the fan base was for some time separated when Knight was away. So you can't, you have to handle the situation carefully, even if you wanted to make a change. So I just can't see them, almost feeling pressured that Ohio State might get our guy. It's time to get rid of Mike. Sorry, Mike. It's been a good run, and throwing one of their own people out the door. I just can't see that happening, right or wrong. It just doesn't feel like the way Indiana should operate.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's no way to treat somebody who has done obviously some good things coming back to Bloomington, making the tournament his first 2 years. Obviously, this season has not gone as anyone had hoped, and I'm sure he's as frustrated as anybody. He said repeatedly that he wants to win as much as anybody. But as you know, Justin, when the momentum gets started heavily in a direction and people start to make up their mind that a coach is not the right person to lead the program, then things can happen quickly, and people, public opinion changes quick. I mean, if you would have told me 4 months ago that we would even be talking about this, I would have thought it was crazy. But it's the bottom line in college basketball is you got to win games. And in a program like Indiana, you're under a constant microscope. The fan base is as passionate as any in the country. They want a team that plays a certain way, fundamentally sound basketball, and they want to win games. And when they don't see the fundamentals and they don't see the winning, they're not going to be shy about their displeasure. And that's kind of what we're seeing now. But Justin, it was good to have you back on the show this week. A lot of fun to tackle some of these questions. Obviously had a great number of questions to choose from. And I kind of felt like we hit a little bit of everything, talking about some of Indiana's issues this season, talking, obviously, people want to talk Mike Woodson and how things are going. So really appreciate you carving out the time after the 9-to-5 job that you work. Actually, not 9 to 5. You're working a ton of hours at your job. But I appreciate you coming on this evening and discussing these questions with us. Really good to have you on the show again.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And hopefully, the Hoosiers can turn it around to some extent and get things moving in the right direction, if for no other reason than for next year.
Yeah, a lot more fun to cover the program, and talk about the program when things are going well, as you know. And appreciate everybody, as always, for continuing to support Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.